Hi, I'm Sister Helen Prejean, and I am so honored and blessed to be participating in this conference about Henri Nouwen. I have to tell you that the first time I met him, I was going to school for theology up at Notre Dame. It was in the 70s, and we'd go to Mass in the different halls, Stanford Hall. So there we are, a bunch of mostly nuns and football players were on the campus at Notre Dame in the summer. You didn't want to get behind one of those football players in the cafeteria because they have 2 trays, 2 quarts of milk. You know, their necks were as big as our thighs. So as football players and nuns, and we're going for theology. It was wonderful, all the classes. So I just popped into Stanford one time for the evening Mass. So the priest that began it, when he began the opening prayers, I noticed that he had kind of a little lisp. And I was thinking, poor baby. I mean, he probably went in the priesthood because he felt so inadequate or whatever. And, I felt sorry for him. I did, And then it came time for the homily. And I was thinking, that's one of the best homilies I have ever heard. He had such a way of taking the spiritual dimensions of life and the gospel and making them real in our human experiences. We came out of the chapel and I said to one of the sisters, who was that guy? They said, well, that was Henri Nouwen. And that's how I met Henri Nouwen. And now the more I know about his life, he's almost like the saint of vulnerability, that he struggled with himself and his identity, and he was very sensitive, and he had a nervous temperament, and he felt rejected easily, and he struggled. And I love that quote of his, that the biggest trap is not success or popularity, it's self-rejection. And that voice inside of us, all of us, myself included. Some can call me the most famous nun in the United States. That doesn't mean a hoot, because we know our weaknesses deep down inside, and that voice is there. Yeah, Ellen, you're nothing but that's a fluke about what you did. And just those negative voices in us, no matter how much we've been loved, there is that in us. And I am thrown into the lives of people. I'm going to tell you, this is just a recent story that's just happened. There's a man that, along with people on death row, there are a few prisoners that I've been keeping up with at our Louisiana State Penitentiary. This man has been in prison 44 years. He did an unspeakable crime. He killed a woman. This is the crime I knew of. Killed a woman and her 2 children. Came up for trial, and somehow through legal maneuvering, they dropped the charges of the killing of the 2 children, and it was for the murder of the woman, which is bad enough. And then he comes up for parole. Well, the victims' families, those that knew the children, of course, are present and don't you dare let him out of this prison. We want him to be in there the rest of his life. That was a blow. They said in 2 years he could have another parole board hearing. And he just got word the other day that he would not have another parole board hearing until 2059. 2059. And the reason is because the district attorney back in the district dug up or presented that he also had killed another woman. And so he had the death of 2 women on his hands. And so that district attorney just filed with the prison and added 40 years onto his sentence already. Now he is experiencing this as a huge blow, and that it's unfair. But in the presence of what he did, that he killed 2 women and he killed 2 children, I know that he's never going to have a chance to get out of prison. And he's suffering, and he has an impeccable record for 40 years. He's not the man on drugs and the person who had been so abused in his life that took it out on other people. And this tremendous suffering. And yet he's guilty of some terrible things, this huge paradox of suffering. And I've been thrown it way above my head of suffering and evil that I've never experienced before. But it throws me back on my own protection and cushioning and resources in my life. I've never done any bad things like that, but I've encountered human beings in their humanness and the inviolable dignity of every human person. The Catholic Church, it took 1,300 years of dialogue, has just reached a position on the death penalty that no matter how terrible the crime, we can never give to governments the right to take life. Because in the church teaching, all the way back, starting with Augustine in the 5th century, that the government has a right to, the evil can be coerced with the sword. That was the first departure from the gospel of Jesus, the nonviolent gospel of Jesus. But history happens, life happens. The tribes, the Goths, the Visigoths, the barbed ones, the barbarians, were knocking down the streets of Rome. The barbed ones were knocking down the gates of Rome and plundering the cities. So Augustine, in light of that, who can be in charge of protecting society? It had to be the civil authorities. So he upheld the use of violence. That started in the 5th century. By the time you get to the 12th century, because they did not have prisons, they did not have a way to keep society safe, then you had Thomas Aquinas in the 12th century saying that the government could execute violent people to protect society. He always compared it to like cutting off a gangrenous limb or putting down a mad dog. It was always about defense of society. But then life changes and we get prisons, and the UN Declaration of Human Rights was declared in 1948. And the inalienable right, simply because you're a person, that you have the right to life. Inalienable, which means governments don't bestow that right to life for good behavior, and they can't take it away for bad behavior. But that 1,300 years of dialogue that has happened with the Catholic Church, and this happens on all the moral issues. It's happening about women in the church. It's happening about gay, the position of the church on gay people. I love that psalm, truth rises from the ground, and it's in the experience of the people. So most of my dialogue has been with the people of God, but not just within the Catholic Church, all over the place, about the death penalty as an inalienable human right. A lot of people don't go to church. And one of the latest polls said now 50% of people are not churched in any way. They're breaking away from institutional religion. And institutional religion, as we well know, has a lot of struggles. Like, in the struggles of our own church, a number of women, young women I know, will have nothing to do with the Catholic Church, the institution. Very interested in the gospel of Jesus and living it, but it is a struggle when you have an institution that does not uphold the dignity of women or practices really rampant sexism. Namely, we're supposed to all be baptized in Christ. We're all supposed to be made in the image and likeness of Christ. And yet, simply because we're women, we cannot occupy the position of priesthood or leadership of worship and prayer with the community. And we also do not occupy any positions of major decision-making or policy, that we have been kept out of that. This book, River of Fire, is the story of my awakening to the gospel of Jesus and the gospel of justice. And in the appendix in the back, I have a letter to Pope Francis. I met him because he intervened. I got involved. We both were involved with an innocent man on death row in Oklahoma, Richard Glossop. That's how I met Pope Francis, was through him. So when I wrote this book, and I addressed him in the letter to Pope Francis, that it's one of the biggest wounds in the Catholic Church, and we can never have a healthy church until we have the participation of women in every one of the discussions and policies. I said, I preach. I've spoken before the United Nations. I've spoken before committees of Congress. I've spoken in churches and synagogues all over this country, but I cannot preach in my own Catholic church. So what happens to us is that when we see something and we experience something, because we all have the Spirit in our hearts, we all have these divine sparks. Not just us, not just people who say they believe in God, or people who are Catholics, or people who go to church. Every human being has two divine sparks. And it is a big part of our loneliness. It is a big part of our thirst and our hunger that we'll always have, because these two divine sparks in us, infinite, are the desire and search for truth, which will never end. We can never have 4 billion, 3 trillion truths and say that's enough truth. We are made to seek truth. And it's an infinite desire, and we will always have it. And some of the greatest stories of tragedy are when people cannot fulfill that. And you have fake news, and you have confusion, and you have limited ways that people can be in a community of truth seekers, that they could seek truth. And so huge tragedies emerge out of that. So the two divine sparks, the desire for truth and the desire to love in a wider circle, in a deeper circle. That's a big thing about Henri Nouwen, was the love of friendship and the love of people, whom we love, he says, even more after they die, because that love is eternal. We're all made to love. He said we all love poorly. It's why we will always need forgiveness. But we are made to love and to deepen and widen our love. And when you look at all the separation that goes on in our society, where we are operating out of fear of the other, when we are made to be afraid of the other, then it is impossible to love them. And that's why we have the walls. That's why throw him in prison. And that's a huge thing. A prison and the death penalty itself is that we are separated from the suffering. We have a label on people. Oh, these are criminals. And we've been made to be afraid of them. All that tough on crime era of the 80s and all through the 90s, of where just longer and longer sentences of throwing human beings away instead of restoring life to people who have been wounded and have hurt others. So separation makes us suspicious, and we believe every stereotypical thing that we hear about people. And in my own journey in River of Fire, where I tell the story of waking up, there were 2 cocoons I had to break out of. One of them was the religious, privatized religion, me and Jesus kind of cocoon. I'm a nun, I'm prayerful. And my whole approach to the big problems of the world was to pray, to ask God to help the suffering people, the starving children in India, the homeless people. I prayed. These are God's problems, these big problems. I also would say, I'm apolitical. I don't get involved with political confusion and mess that's going on. I pray for people. I had to break out of that cocoon. And then also the other of living out in the suburbs and really basically believing that the gospel of Jesus called me to be charitable to people around me. Always to be charitable, but not to work for justice. I didn't understand about justice. I resisted. I said, look, we are nuns. We are not social workers. When the debate came up in the community that we needed to start getting involved with the issues of racism and the striving for justice. And that separation out in the suburbs, or even when I joined the community, I only knew black people as our servants when I was growing up in Baton Rouge. We even had a servants' quarters in the back of our big 2-story house. And my daddy was a successful lawyer. Mom and Dad always kind to Ellen and Jesse, didn't even know their last names. They lived in the servants' quarters. Daddy helped Ellen and Jesse buy a house, helped Jesse get a good job at the refinery in Baton Rouge, but never questioned the Jim Crow laws that separated us. And that's how strong culture is. culture gives us eyes and ears. Well, honey, it's better for the races to be separate from each other, because when we're brought together, people fight, and I just accepted it. And we accept culture and faith. It's going to take faith to break through that. In the waking up, I call it, in River of Fire, I call it the lightning chapter, because when lightning comes, it had been building in me. We were having these huge debates in the community about whether or not as sisters we needed to be involved in the issues of justice. So we had some of our sisters coming up from Latin America. I mean, they're watching the death squads at work. I mean, seeing just tremendous suffering of people in Latin America. And they come back to our meetings. And they had to really struggle because we seemed so removed. We were removed. I was. And so then they stir in the pot. And here's how the Spirit works. Stir in the pot. Sisters, what are we engaged in as North American sisters of what's going on in the United States? Merton had the same struggle, when he finally wrote those letters about the racism and segregation. Got in trouble with his abbot, but he mimeographed his notes to get them out to people because the abbot said he couldn't publish his letters. But that stirring in us of, wait a minute, the gospel of Jesus is about more than being kind to the people around me. Like we little goldfish in this bowl. Just be kind to the other little goldfish all around you. But don't worry about what's going on where these fish are being eaten alive in a big sea out there. It takes grace to wake us up, and it was grace that came to me at a conference in Terre Haute where this Sister Marie Augusta Neal, a sister of Notre Dame de Namur, had us for 3 days to talk to us about the gospel and justice. I made it through the first day unscathed because she gave the whole position of the rich countries of the world, the poor, and I said, well, I knew things were unfair. But I had this thing of what's one little person going to do? It's a great big world out there. And then she said, and tomorrow we'll speak about the gospel of Jesus. And I was happy. I slept like a little baby that night. I said, at last, we're going to get away from all this social justice stuff, trying to get us to be revolutionaries. We're going to hear some Jesus. Bring on Jesus. And she did. And here was the line. It changed the spiritual trajectory of my life. And she said, Jesus preached good news to the poor. And I thought I knew what the next line was going to be. About how every hair of our head is numbered. How God is so close to us. Not just like a father, but like a daddy, Abba. You can call God daddy. And those of you who are poor, one day you will have a great reward, and the last will be first. And instead, she said, integral to the good news Jesus preached to poor people was it was not God's will for them to be poor, and they had a right to struggle for what was rightfully theirs, that it was part of their dignity. And I sat there stunned. I didn't move physically, but I mean inside, it was a stunning that I had gotten it all wrong, that I had spiritualized it. Oh yeah, one day they're going to have a great reward. Sorry, your children are dying before they're 3 years old. Sorry about your poverty, because I had never lifted one finger to participate in anything you could call justice. I have been nothing but grateful that God finally woke me up. I was in my 40s when I woke up. But what's important is that when we do wake up, what we do after we wake up is really important, that we have to act out of that right away. Are we going to get paralyzed? We're going to self-question it. We're going to go, oh yeah, well, let me lay out my little master plan here, see what I'm going to do. Immediately to move with grace. And then, so when I came back to New Orleans after that conference, I immediately started getting on a bus and going into the inner city and to go and be among my African American brothers and sisters. Over 50% of the people of the population of New Orleans, poor, struggling against the police, poor public education, poor everything. And they became my teachers. And I sat at their feet and I listened to their stories, and they taught me. And then I was ready to read the life of Martin Luther King and the life of Dorothy Day, and the people then who were engaged. And I give a lot of talks now, and out of River of Fire, talking with a group of young people in a university yesterday, and just saying to them that hope is an active verb. You got to be doing something. You got to, no matter how small, but you got to be doing something. You got to put your hand on the rope, whether it's going to be about kids or whether it's going to be about people that don't have food or whatever it is. And then life courses through us, and hope then becomes active in us. But when we standing on the side and trying to just look at, oh, well, I could do this, I could do that, oh, it's so overwhelming, we're paralyzed. Hope is an active verb. And so, and in River of Fire, then I take you with me about the unfolding of one issue after another of the issues, just seeing what happened to people when they didn't have health care, like Geraldine coming to the sister's apartment at Hope House, and little Gerald was sick, just a 3-year-old kid. He had high fever. She had no health care. She couldn't go into the ER. She couldn't call her primary physician. What you did when you were poor, you went and sat on a plastic chair on a terrazzo floor and waited for some tired little intern from one of the medical schools, LSU or Tulane, to come see your child. And I happened to bring her to that hospital that night and waited with her from 11 o'clock at night. She has her little shivering child with fever, huddled, sitting in that plastic chair. And then around 3 o'clock, here comes an intern, saw her, gave her medication for her child. When you are poor, you wait. Waiting is just part of being poor. And it brought me to when my little brother Louis, just 6 months old, had double pneumonia and almost died. And Mama, who had been a nurse at Our Lady of the Lake, knew the doctors, and they get Louis in that hospital, and they get him oxygen, and they give him care, and they save his life. That we always had health care. And even as nuns today, we're privileged. We not only have white privilege, we got nun privilege, because we have health care, we have housing. You need another job, we'll help you find one. I mean, for what ministry you're going to do. And so it keeps us from that edge, you know. So, but what we're called to do, and I learned this, I had to leave where I was to go over, to be immersed where the people. I love this image of Pope Francis. And Nouwen would have loved Pope Francis. He says about we as church or as believers need to be field hospitals out close to where the wounded and suffering people are. So we need to be there at the border. We need to be there in the prisons. We need to be where the people are suffering. That is our call. And it's not an extra. It's not a little luxury that you're going to go do social justice after you've done everything else. And what it plunged me into of seeing the other America like this is it plunged me into wanting to understand, and I began to read to understand the systems. Why are these people poor and what is happening? Why in public housing? Why was it always in shambles? Why Miss Eve, who lived up on the 4th floor of the apartments and had a leaky faucet for like 3 years in her apartment, and when she'd get out of her wheelchair in that bathroom, her feet were wet, and called maintenance and called maintenance and called maintenance. But she was one poor lady on welfare. And what priority is she going to be given to come fix the leak in her apartment? And I remember my daddy, if we had something going wrong, he called the plumbers, they were there. Called the electrician, they were there. But when you're poor and you don't have a voice and you're not treated with respect, you're made to wait. And boy, that got to me. and what I kept coming to, especially happened in our adult learning center where people were coming to get their GEDs. Or Miss Ruby, she was 75 and she was coming to learn because she wanted to learn to read because she was intrigued with this Moses person in the Bible. The Moses could go up on that mountain and he could talk to God. And he would come down and his face would be shining. He had to put a veil. She wanted to know about that Moses. And so we began. Her learning to read was about Moses. And we spent a lot of time with those passages about Moses. 75. Why hadn't she gotten an education? Because she was first working in the fields as a child in Louisiana, a lot of agriculture, sugarcane, cotton. And then she cleaned white people's houses. And now at 75, she wants to learn to read. And I'm realizing, watching the people come in, of just what a gift it is to be educated. I mean, just even reading about women's role in the 18th and 19th century, early 20th century, women were the workhorses in the house. Women were cooking the food. Women were doing the laundry. And women, not to be educated, women were just doing all this manual work, reading John Lewis's book about his mama at 62 is still working out in the cotton fields. The hard manual work that, as privileged white people, I have never had to do hard manual work. We did jobs around the convent. You had to clean, but that was nothing. Because we could be educated, and to be educated meant we were kind of had the luxury of being able to go to school and get educated. Not just an undergraduate degree, but a master's, and even people getting PhDs. So when I went to write a book about the experience of being in the execution chamber and watching what happened when people were strapped down and electrocuted to death. In fact, that's the fire part of River of Fire, was watching a man be killed in the electric chair. And it goes like this. They killed a man with fire one night. They strapped him in a wooden chair and pumped electricity through his body until he was dead. His killing was a legal act because he had killed. No religious leaders protested the killing that night, but I was there. I saw it with my own eyes, and what I saw set my soul on fire, a fire that burns in me still. And now here is an account of how I came to be in the killing chamber that night. And when, in the early morning hours of April 5th, 1984, it was just the anniversary, I watched Patrick Sonnier being executed in the electric chair, which is what I'm talking about here. I came out of that execution chamber. There's this saying from Latin America, what the eye does not see, the heart cannot feel. And it was in the middle of the night. First thing I did was throw up. I vomited. I had never witnessed such a premeditated protocol of death enacted upon a human being. And then, and that mission has never left me. It was just very clear. I've been drawn in as a witness. As a witness, I have a moral imperative to tell this story. I didn't know what I was going to do. It was 1984. 90% of the people in Louisiana were for the death penalty then. All the 80s. That was a time when they got the most political currency for running for public office, and the tougher you were on crime, the quicker you got elected, and even criticizing or demeaning others who were weak on crime, saying they were against the death penalty. This is the first presidential election we have had where we had somebody run for president who actually said, I'm against the death penalty. Joe Biden, and he's going to do something about it. How about that for stretching out the meaning of what pro-life means? He's doing it in so many ways. But there, shivering outside that gate, it was cold. The mission was born, and it came out of that fire. I knew what I had seen. I also knew this. I even thought, it came to my mind, the scripture passage where Jesus had looked out at the crowd and he had said, they're like sheep without a shepherd. And I knew the American people were good people. I knew they had been made to be afraid, that these criminals, by their nature, by what they had done, they were the worst of the worst. We couldn't afford to ever let them. Even put them in prison, they'll kill other inmates and the guards. The only thing we can do is that we have to terminate them. And I thought of them. Actually, I thought of all of you, though I couldn't put faces on you. And I knew what my job was. And it was, I got to go to the people. We got to face the horror of the crimes, because you have to take people with you on the whole journey. There are two arms on the cross, and you want to descend into the gospel of Jesus. We really have to stand there in the horror of when innocent people are killed. We have to stand there. We have to feel the horror. We have to recognize in ourselves that voice that rises. They deserve to die for what they did, and be in touch with that. And then to work our way with the gospel of Jesus, pulling us and drawing us over to the other side. Even those among us who have done this crime have inviolable dignity as human beings that cannot be taken from them. We have to, it is a hard issue because we have such ambivalence in our heart about it. And those two arms of the cross, and I'll show you this cross now. It was given to me by the brother of Patrick Sonnier. Patrick Sonnier was executed and killed for the crime of killing two teenage kids. His brother Eddie, younger, got 2 life sentences. When I went to visit Eddie after I'd been with his brother through his execution, Eddie gave me this cross. Actually, if you read Dead Man Walking, you're going to see it's a complex story. That actually Eddie is the one who killed the 2 teenage kids that night. He was in a very emotional, volatile state, and bang, 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 he had a gun in his hands and he killed them. And my first visit with him after the execution of his brother, he gave me this cross. It's the only one I've ever had that was purchased with blood. The only way Eddie could get a little money to pay another inmate to construct the cross for him was by selling his plasma. He got $7.50. When you're working in the fields, you get 2.5 cents an hour, what they call incentive pay. And he gave me this cross. And it's such a symbol of the unspeakable evil side by side with grace. Because Eddie, imagine living in that reality. In fact, when the warden let him come to the wake of his brother, he didn't let him come to the funeral, and we had to get his body. We had to get a funeral home to, give him the services free, because he had begged me, "Sister, please don't let me be buried here at Angola. They just throw you in a hole in the ground. And they're the ones killing me. Please don't let me be buried here." So, man, you'll see in those pages in Dead Man Walking, I'm calling the sisters, where can we bury him? Where can we find a funeral home? A suit we got to get. So the sisters are all helping me. So he was buried with the nuns. So we were able to do that. The dignity. The saddest funerals I have ever been to are with these poor little families where somebody in their family did a crime and was executed. And there's the family, there's the mother, there's huddled in their grief and their shame, such shame that you had a child so bad that the state killed him, and trying to keep the press away, trying to get in and take pictures of mothers fainting when they see their children, or this whole crazy, crazy thing. And wouldn't that be where Jesus would be? That's where Henri Nouwen was and would be. That's the Henri Nouwen in us. That compassion for that deep humanity, and there but for the grace of God go I. Let me be in touch with all my privilege, all my cushioning, all my resources, that when they are going through, 90% of people on death row were abused as children. So the abuse is heaped on them, the violence is heaped on them. This is not to excuse what they did, But one day they take that violence out. That chaos inside them, they take that violence out on another human being, and then the state wants to kill them. And coming up close to this fire, to this suffering, has humbled me. And I need to be humbled, because I don't have virtue. I just have a lot of protection. And so what has given me hope is, as we have carried out this discourse and dialogue, I have a strong, good social media team. We're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, to stay out in public discourse in the public square. So continue to be a voice in the public discourse. And then you write books, and then you give talks, and you stay in it, because the hearts of the people are good. And do you know what gives me hope? I think of all the, I don't know how many it's been, in every city, every state, crisscross in this nation, that what most of the people say, see, people have not reflected deeply on the death penalty. It's not one of the issues that people reflect on naturally. It doesn't hit them because they don't have anybody on death row, or maybe even the more well-off you are, you don't even have people in prison. So you're not reflecting. And you get a person to tell you a story and bring you into this, and then have you standing there present to that electric chair and bring you through the execution, but also bring you over into the suffering of the victim's family. I had a great editor that helped me shape Dead Man Walking, or you never would have heard of this book. He helped me, first of all, because in the first draft, I was so keen on talking about the human rights of that Pat Saunier should not be executed, and his dignity as a person. And when Jason Epstein at Random House looked at the draft, he just said, nobody's going to read your book. You wait far too long to talk about the crime. All your readers going to be thinking is, what did he do? Who did he kill? You're not talking about that. And if you don't talk about that crime of those two brothers, or at least one of them that did the killing, putting their gun, their .22 rifle, against the back of the heads of those kids and shooting them 3 times and killing them, and leaving their bodies in that sugarcane field in all its horror and your own outrage at that, nobody's going to read your book. And then your task as a writer is going to be to stand in the outrage of these innocent lives, nipped literally in the bud of their life, and then to take the reader with you into that execution chamber. Is this the solution? He also helped me face up to a big mistake I made. And it was, I didn't know what to do with the victim's family. I was hearing the parents of these teenage kids that were killed. Everybody was Catholic in this. And Mr. Bourke, the Bourke family had lost their daughter Loretta. She was 18. The LeBlanc family had lost their son, David. He was just 17. He didn't hear anything on the news from Mr. LeBlanc, but boy, the Bourques were out there. And Mr. Bourke, his daughter, brutally killed like that. And he said how he wanted to pull the switch himself. And I just thought, they are so angry. And they're so traumatized. I'm the last person in the world they're going to want to see. I'm the spiritual advisor to the two people who killed their beloved kids. And I stayed away. I didn't do one blooming thing. I didn't write him a note, anything. And I couldn't have met him at a worse time. It was during the pardon board hearing. And you actually sign a book. It was a pardon board hearing 1 week before Pat Saunier was executed. It would be the last chance for mercy to be shown him by the 5 governor appointees on the pardon board. And anybody walked into that room at that hearing signed a book, which side are you on? I had never signed a book that so clearly delineated. They had the life page that you wanted to ask the pardon board to spare his life, and they had the death page. You wanted the execution to proceed. And the victim's family is there with their relatives, with their friends. They had been told by the prosecutors, you pack that room and don't you let that pardon board get away with depriving you of your justice. And justice meant only one thing. He killed your kid, we kill him. And you make sure you're there to make sure it happens. So that part of the book was filled. And then there were only 3 of us on the life side, me, This attorney, Millard Farmer, did so much to try to save Pat's life in the appeals courts, but it was too late. And a psychiatrist, Brad Fisher, who wanted to try to talk about that Pat Saunier loved to work, actually, and could have worked the rest of his life in Angola and not been a threat to anybody. And, of course, you kind of knew how it was going to go, you hoped. And they were inside voting, and we were walking outside. And I ran smack dab into the victims' families, to the Borks, Mr. and Mrs. Bork, and Mr. and Mrs. LeBlanc. And the Borks were furious. When does the nun show up? Oh, yeah, she's going to show up here for the murder. She didn't do anything for us. And they just walked past me in stony silence. And right behind them were the LeBlancs. And I expected the same thing. And here's the great surprise that Henri Nouwen loved to talk about, the surprise of grace, and walk right up to me, the LeBlancs who had lost their son. And Lloyd LeBlanc, the father, walked right up to me. He said, Sister Helen, I'm Lloyd LeBlanc. It's our son David, who was killed. Sister, all this time, you've been visiting those two brothers, and you didn't once come see us. You can't believe what we're going through with this death penalty thing. I was so wrong. I said, I'm so sorry, Mr. LeBlanc. I didn't think you'd want to see me. He said, Sister, you don't know what I think till you come and see what I think. And here was a man struggling with the death penalty. And he invited me then. I called him afterwards, and he invited me to come pray with him in this little chapel. Kept vigil before the Blessed Sacrament, 4 to 5 in the morning, at St. Martin of Tours Church in St. Martinville, Louisiana. And boy, that was an invitation of grace. I had done it all wrong. He was the gracious one. He invited me to come pray with him, and I did. And in the course of our praying together, we became friends. And then he shared the inner journey of what it meant to come by the grace of God to a place of forgiveness. And the way he took me through his journey helped me understand, even if you look at the word forgive, it means to give before. And it's not about in any way condoning anything. But the way Lloyd explained it to me was, at first I was so filled with anger. I wanted to kill both of those brothers with my own bare hands. But I've always been a kind person. I love to help people. I was angry all the time. I'm snapping at Eula, my wife, and making that poor woman cry. I thought, and he could see the anger just taking him over, consuming him. He kept praying. He knew that was not what Jesus was calling him to do, and he could see himself being consumed by it. And then with the grace of God, and at one point, and sharing with me, and he put his hand out like this. And then he said, and then I said, They killed my boy, but I'm not going to let them kill me. I'm going to do what Jesus said. So I write that up. And of course, in the first draft, I said in there, I'd never done this before, so I stayed away. I thought I'd cause him more pain. And Jason Epstein, my good editor, angel of God, my Jewish angel of God, says to me, well, Sister Helen, it was cowardice, wasn't it? You were scared, weren't you? I went, well, yeah. He said, look, when you write your story, don't just take people on the good side or the peak of the waves when you do it right. Take them in the troughs when you do it wrong. Because everybody's human, and they're going to recognize your truthfulness there if you acknowledge when you make mistakes, and they'll read your book. And that was so helpful. So I had to go and face what I had done so wrong and not reaching out to the victim's family. Ever afterwards, when I took a man on death row, I always reached out to the victim's family. But Lloyd LeBlanc was my teacher, and he's the hero of Dead Man Walking, because he made his way through that crucible of pain and anger and came out. And we seldom think of what happens to families when their child has done a terrible crime. But Mrs. Saunier, Pat Nettie's mother, lived in this little town of St. Martinville. and would find dead animals on her front porch thrown there, and teenagers driving around at night, mother of the murderer, mother of the murderers. And so she became like a little hermit. She turned off her TV close to the execution of Patrick, and had the blinds closed. She had her daughter bring her food. She couldn't even go to the grocery store. She'd hear people pointing at her, and then one day she hears somebody on her front porch, and she looks through the blinds, and she sees it's a man, and he's standing there. He's got something in his hands, and goes and opens the front door, and it's Lloyd LeBlanc, and he has a basket of fruit, and he gives it to her. Miss Sonia, he says, I know you're having a tough time in this town. He said, look, I just want to say to you, you're a parent, I'm a parent. As parents, we really don't know what our kids might do. They are themselves. And here is my number. If you need me, you call me. He was the only one in that town that showed compassion to that mother whose sons had done such an unspeakable thing. And see, when we legalize hatred, when we legalize that it's okay to kill a person, you can't say, don't let that affect the community now. Now, nobody else, don't hate the mother, don't hate his brothers and sisters. We just want to put like a laser beam and hate him and kill him as if we can do that. And then you have the Lloyd LeBlancs who arise among us. And I'll hold him up as the hero. So all of that's in the story of Dead Man Walking, and the story, I'm just a bearer of the story. I know it's much bigger than me. Like a lot of people say, ooh, what's it like to have an opera? And here's a person who's a Sister Helen. This is so much bigger than me. And I'm the bearer of the story. And so when the film came out, when the opera came out, when Tim has done the play to do in schools, I know it's bigger than me. And I'm glad I woke up and that I can participate in this. The gospel of Jesus becomes real to me, did become real, when I got involved with the suffering ones and just also realized my privilege. That's what holds my feet to the fire, as my good little Southern mama would say, along with saying, after the book came out, now, Helen, now you're famous. For God's sake, now don't do anything stupid. Because she knows me. She's my mama, see. But it's just like in the presence of that kind of suffering, you know, what are we to do? And it fills me with fire to keep doing this work till we end this thing of government killing, and my fellow Catholics as well along the way. So God bless Henri Nouwen. Henri, I know you're with us today, and thank you that you shared your vulnerability with us, that it really helps us. None of us are this citadel of strength. We have cracks in our walls that open up so quickly, and you manifest it to us that we can be truly close to God, even in our vulnerability. And I thank you for that.